In the spring of 1945, as war raged across Europe and the world braced for what would become its bloodiest finale, a strange kind of quiet settled over the plains of Kansas. The wheat fields swayed gently in the breeze. Farmers read the headlines about Hitler's retreat and the Allies' advances. But in the small town of Winfield, the war had already arrived in a different form, not through bombs or soldiers, but through 25 young German women in gray uniforms, stepping down from a train with shackled ankles and eyes filled with confusion. They were prisoners of war. Or at least, that's what the U.S. military classified them as. Captured from various parts of war-torn Europe, some from captured field hospitals, others from the remains of labor camps where they had been nurses, cooks, or simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. These women had been shipped across the ocean, not to be punished, but to be useful. That was the word used in the government memos. Useful.America had a labor shortage. Its men were overseas, dying or killing. Its women were working factories or managing households alone. Farms were understaffed. And so, in what would later be known in obscure historical records as the Extended Civilian POW Support Act, German women were offered as labor to agricultural communities under the guise of rehabilitation and mutual aid. But what happened in Winfield, Kansas, wasn't rehabilitation. It was a quiet kind of captivity one, dressed in Sunday church clothes and baked into apple pies. Marta Weiss was 19. She had never seen a cowboy before, had never even imagined what Kansas looked like until the train door opened and the dry heat hit her like a slap. Her only crime had been volunteering as a Red Cross nurse near Munich. She didn't believe in Hitler, didn't fight for the Reich, but she wore a uniform. That was enough. When she was processed to the Ellis Island Detention Center, no one spoke to her. She signed documents she didn't understand. The next day, she was placed on a train with a dozen other young women, some of them crying, some blank, all too exhausted to protest. When they arrived at Winfield's modest station, a group of local men stood waiting. Not soldiers, not officers. Farmers' dot wasn't an auction. But it felt close. Each man held papers. The women were paired off, loaded into trucks, and driven away like cattle, their destination a mystery. Marta was taken by a man named Joseph Dunning, a widower in his 40s with a square jaw, sunburned skin, and a wedding ring he still wore out of habit. He said 3 words to her: house, clean, obey. She didn't speak English. She nodded. The Dunning farm was isolated, dry, and eerily silent. Joseph had 2 sons, one at war, the other a child barely 10. Marta cooked, cleaned, fed the animals, and was told to stay out of sight. Joseph didn't abuse her. Not at first. But he also never acknowledged her as a human being. To him, she was a replacement, a placeholder, a wife-shaped shadow. Other women were placed in similar homes. Letters they tried to write were intercepted. Some attempted to escape. One, named Elise, tried to walk to a bus station in the middle of the night. She was found the next morning by a highway patrol officer and returned like stolen property. She spent the next 3 months locked in a root cellar. No charges. No court. The town didn't ask questions. The government didn't check. By midsummer, Marta noticed her situation changing. Joseph began introducing her as his girl, then his fiancée. By autumn, a private ceremony was held on the Dunning porch. There was no marriage license, no legal witnesses, just a reverend, a borrowed white dress, and a photograph that would later hang in the town's war museum with no plaque. Marta had become a wife. On paper, she was still a POW. The marriage wasn't unique. In fact, it had become common. Of the 25 women brought to Winfield, 17 were married by the end of the year. Some genuinely fell in love, or at least convinced themselves they had. Others complied out of survival. One was 16. Her husband was 50-2. As the war ended, word came that Pays would be repatriated. But a strange legal gray zone emerged. If these women were now married, were they still prisoners? Could the U.S. deport American wives of American citizens? The government shrugged. Local officials claimed the women had integrated. Washington didn't object. And just like that, the door home was shut. Marta never saw Germany again. She gave birth to 2 children. She learned English, but never forgot her native tongue. Her accent remained thick. In church, some whispered that she had been a Nazi, that she had chosen to stay. They didn't know the truth. No one had asked. She wasn't allowed to speak of her past. One winter, years later, her daughter brought home a school assignment about World War II. Marta sat at the kitchen table and trembled as she read the questions. Did your family fight? Where were your grandparents during the war? She couldn't answer. That night, she burned the only photo she had of her parents. Not out of shame, but because she no longer knew if she was allowed to remember them. In the years following the war, Winfield remained quiet about its brides. The women, now labeled naturalized through circumstance, were scattered across surrounding farms, hidden behind white picket fences and locked memories. No one in town asked where they had come from. They were simply the war girls, a whispered footnote to a chapter no one wanted to reopen. But inside those homes, the story hadn't ended. Some of the women adapted, carving out identities from scraps. Ilse Becker, once a dressmaker in Bremen, taught herself quilting. Her patchwork blankets became famous across Kansas, admired for their precision and melancholy patterns. But no one knew the symbols sewn into them, woven references to places and people long gone, secret codes of resistance and longing. Others fared worse. Anna Vogel, brought to Oklahoma by a cattle rancher, was pregnant within 3 months. Her husband had filed paperwork claiming she had consented to the marriage. The paperwork was fake. Her priest was a cousin. No agency checked. When Anna lost the baby, she was blamed for failing in her duties. She was locked in a spare room for 2 weeks. By the time she was let out, her hair had turned gray. What united these women wasn't just trauma, it was silence. They were not allowed to gather, not permitted to form community. Some tried to meet in church basements, disguised as knitting circles. But their English was limited, their movements monitored. Any signs of cultural bonding were labeled suspicious. One sheriff's wife reported a gathering to the FBI, calling it a German cell. The women were interrogated. 2 were relocated. No charges were filed. Marta Weiss learned to keep her head down. After her marriage to Joseph, she cooked 3 meals a day, cleaned the same wooden floors until her knees swelled, and raised 2 boys who called her Mama, but never once asked where she came from. Joseph never struck her, but he didn't have to. His control came through silence, never letting her write home, never allowing her to send photos. When her mother died in Dresden, she found out a year later from a Red Cross newsletter smuggled by another woman. By the early 1950s, the world had moved on. America had entered a new war, this time in Korea. The German POW wives became ghosts in their own country. Official records had been lost or classified. The military no longer acknowledged the program. Local politicians claimed it never existed. When a journalist from St. Louis tried to write an expose, he was told the women were war brides, legally married, end of story. But there had been no courtships. No choice, just contracts in silence. One woman, Lotte Meyer, found her voice. In 1953, she escaped. After years of abuse on a Nebraska farm, she slipped away at night, took a bus to Chicago, and found refuge in a Lutheran mission. There, she met a lawyer who agreed to help. She filed a lawsuit, not for money, but for her name. She wanted to annul the marriage, gain citizenship on her own terms, and return to Germany. The case gained attention. For the first time, national newspapers printed the words German POW brides. But the response wasn't sympathy, it was outrage. Letters flooded in, accusing Lot of betraying the country that saved her. Senators denounced her as a Nazi whore. The mission housing her was firebombed. No one was arrested. She dropped the case. Some women tried to reconnect with Germany. They wrote to embassies, to relatives. Most never got replies. Some found their families dead, cities bombed into ash. Others were told, brutally, that their return was unwelcome, seen as collaborators, race traitors, or worse. One woman's brother replied with a single sentence, "You are no sister of mine." Marta's chance at contact came in 1955, when West Germany offered an amnesty program for displaced citizens. She wrote to the consulate, hoping for some kind of acknowledgement, a visa, a path back. She waited 6 months. When the envelope came, it contained a single-page letter. Her application had been denied. Reason, status, voluntary residency abroad. She hadn't volunteered for any of it. As the 1960s began, many of the women started fading from view. Some died young from illness, from childbirth, from heartbreak. Others became invisible grandmothers, baking cookies and attending PTA meetings, their accents softened but never erased. The towns accepted them, so long as they asked no questions and told no stories. One by one, their names disappeared from memory. But history has its own gravity. And secrets, no matter how deeply buried, have a way of surfacing. In 1972, a graduate student from the University of Kansas began a research project on post-war rural immigration. He interviewed locals in Winfield. Most declined, but an old farmer named Joseph Dunning agreed. He spoke for an hour about wheat yields, water rights, and the good old days. Then, offhandedly, he mentioned his first wife. She was one of those German girls. From the war, he said. Came on a train. We married her quick. The student froze. He asked if Joseph still had any records. Joseph laughed. Hell no. Government told us not to keep any. But he did have a photo, a black and white image of Marta on the porch, holding a broom, her face unreadable. The student asked what happened to her. Joseph shrugged. She passed. Liver thing, I think. Didn't talk much. The photo was later archived in a university collection. Marta's name wasn't even labeled, and so, like many others, she vanished from the official story. By the late 1970s, the American landscape had shifted. Vietnam was over, Watergate had scarred public trust, and a new wave of historical reflection had begun. Universities encouraged oral histories. The silence of the forgotten women started to crack, not because they were finally heard, but because some refused to remain invisible. Elizabeth Liesel Hartman, now in her 60s, contacted a young journalist named Karin Mendoza, who was working on a book about wartime migration. They met in a diner in Topeka. Liesel arrived early, wore gloves despite the summer heat, and carried a faded manila folder filled with photos and yellowed letters. I don't want revenge, she began. I want truth. For the next 4 hours, she spoke. She told Karen about her arrival in 1945, how she was assigned to a tobacco farm in Kentucky, and how she was married 2 weeks later to a man named Charles Boone, twice her age, a widower with 3 sons. I didn't understand the vows. I didn't understand anything, she said. But when I hesitated, the priest said I'd go back to the camp if I refused. And I had seen the camp. Karen asked what the camp was like. Liesel looked away. You don't want to know. She shared documents, letters with blacked out sentences, fake marriage licenses, even a copy of her medical record from the local clinic, showing injuries listed as accidental. Karen published her story in a regional magazine. The response was explosive. Some readers demanded justice. Others denied it ever happened. Still, more women came forward. In Missouri, a retired librarian named Greta told her story of being taken in by a family who promised to teach her American values, but instead confined her to a cellar for nearly a year. In Idaho, a woman named Katya recalled being forced to change her name to Katie, wear only American-made clothes, and sing hymns at dinner like a pet or trophy. By 1982, the stories had coalesced into a grassroots project, the Brides Project. Karen Mendoza helped compile over 24 testimonies, all from women who had been POWs, transported across states, and married under informal or forced circumstances. They tried to sue the federal government. The lawsuit was dismissed. The judge cited lack of documentation and statute of limitations. But the media coverage sparked interest from abroad. In West Germany, a documentary filmmaker named Klaus Bremer visited Kansas and filmed interviews with 5 of the women. The documentary, titled Stolen Vows, aired in 1985. It caused a stir in Europe. In America, crickets. Local channels refused to broadcast it. Churches called it anti-family propaganda. Veteran groups labeled it revisionist nonsense. The Department of Defense issued a short statement. We have no record of such a program. But records began to surface. In 1987, a retired Army logistics officer, Colonel Raymond J. Farber, released a private memoir. In it, he casually referenced the POW Relocation and Labor Integration Initiative, a classified project launched in 1944. It included provisions for domestic placements, marriage incentives, and behavioral tracking. One passage read, marital arrangements, though informal, have yielded positive results. Female POWs demonstrate better integration when paired with local male sponsors. It was the smoking gun. A declassified document followed, listing over 400 German women transferred for integration. Names, dates, destinations. Some names matched the testimonies. The government, under pressure, opened a limited investigation. The findings were released quietly, buried in a stack of unrelated Cold War archives. Conclusion: the program did occur in isolated instances. No further action recommended. But the women were no longer silent. At a small community college in Oklahoma, a group of students, moved by Liesel's story, organized a memorial exhibition titled The Brides You Never Knew. It featured artifacts, photographs, and voice recordings. At the entrance, a photo of Anna Vogel, her gray eyes staring blankly at a wedding veil she never asked for. Visitors wept. By 1990, some towns began to acknowledge what had happened. A church in Nebraska added a plaque to its cemetery, listing the names of 6 women buried under their married names, without family or legacy. A museum in Kansas added a display on wartime displacement. It wasn't justice, but it was a beginning. Liesel passed away in 1994. Her final request was simple: that her German name be engraved on her headstone, alongside the American one she never chose. Karen Mendoza fulfilled it herself. The stone reads, Elizabeth Hartman Boone, 1923-1994 letters, survivor of silence decades later. Her granddaughter would speak about her at a conference on historical trauma. She didn't tell us until she was dying, she said. And when she did, it changed everything I thought I knew about this country. The granddaughter went on to become a human rights lawyer. The legacy of the German POW brides did not end with their deaths. Their children, grandchildren, and students carried their stories forward into books, films, and quiet conversations over coffee. They became more than whispers. They became warnings warnings about what happens when power meets silence, about how history forgets what it doesn't want to remember, and about how some women lost in the footnotes of war refused to disappear. Today, in a rural cemetery in Kansas, wildflowers grow around a simple stone. Sometimes, visitors leave small notes beneath it. Most say the same thing. We remember you now. By the time the war officially ended in Europe in May 1945, the small farming towns of Oklahoma, Kansas, and rural Texas had already absorbed the quiet permanence of the German women they once called temporary workers. But the paperwork never caught up. While Washington argued over what to do with these women, who weren't soldiers, but technically weren't immigrants either, the towns themselves had already passed silent verdicts. The women stayed. Or, more accurately, they were never given the choice to leave. In Dusty Creek, all 25 women assigned to local farms were still there, year after Germany's surrender. Some now had babies in their arms. Others bore wedding bands given in hasty ceremonies at local courthouses. For many, the weddings were never legally recognized in either country. They lived in limbo, no longer prisoners, not quite citizens, and forgotten by both sides of the Atlantic. There was no formal release, no letters from the Red Cross, no offers of repatriation. Only a new set of rules, this time written in English, delivered through local church leaders and county sheriffs. Hildegard Weber, once a nurse in Dresden before her capture, had been placed with a childless couple in their 60s. When the war ended, she asked to return to Germany to care for her aging mother. The farmer told her that wouldn't be possible. Too dangerous now, too many communists, he said. Her letters were returned unopened. She was told her mother likely didn't survive the bombings anyway. Hildegard remained in Dusty Creek until her death in 1972, buried under the name Hilda Webb. Her accent long faded. Her memories not doubt Lot Muller's story was more public. Her marriage to a war veteran had made local headlines in 1947 as a patriotic redemption story. Nazi bride becomes American mom, read the Amarillo Gazette. But what the papers didn't mention was that Lot had been pregnant when the wedding occurred, the result of an assault that took place the winter before. Her husband had been one of the guards at the camp where she'd worked peeling potatoes. She told no one. Not then, not later. The child was raised as American as apple pie, never knowing his origins, never hearing a word of German. Others weren't so lucky. Some women tried to flee. At least 4 were picked up in Oklahoma City, trying to buy train tickets under false names. 2 were sent back to their husbands without charges. 1 vanished entirely. And 1, Elizabeth Kruger, managed to get to New York with the help of the sympathetic priest who gave her money and papers. She was arrested at the docks boarding a ship for Bremen. The government had no policy for women like her. She wasn't a soldier. She wasn't even a legal immigrant. She was simply detained and later placed in a convent in upstate New York, where she remained for over a decade before being quietly deported in 1960 by the 1950s. The story of the German war brides had become one of silent resignation. Most stopped writing home. The letters either never arrived or were censored beyond recognition. Their German names were anglicized, their pasts erased. Children grew up not knowing their mothers' histories. In some towns, the women themselves became strange ghosts, barely visible, always working, forever polite, but somehow never fully present. They spoke less, smiled more, and adjusted to a country that never truly welcomed them, but also never fully let them go. In 1963, a journalist named Marlene Bixby began researching war brides for a piece in Life magazine. She traveled through Kansas and Texas and stumbled upon Dusty Creek. She interviewed 6 of the original 25 women, now in their 40s and 50s. What she found shocked her. Not just the conditions they had lived in, but the fact that none of them had ever been given the choice to leave. They didn't even know they could ask, Bixby wrote. Her article was spiked before publication. Too political, her editor said. The silence surrounding these women persisted. No official recognition was ever given. No compensation, no apology. In the 1980s, a few began to speak out. Quiet interviews on local radio. Letters to embassies. Most were ignored. Time moved forward. The country moved on. But the women remembered. Anna Fisher, perhaps the most enduring voice among them, kept a diary in secret for 47 years. She never showed it to her children. After her death in 1999, her granddaughter found it in a tin box wrapped in a lace scarf. In its final entry, Anna wrote, "I was not American, not German. I was something in between. I was a bride in chains, forgotten by peace." Today, most of those women are gone. A few graves remain, scattered in cemeteries across the Midwest. Some with German names, most with American ones. But none with the whole truth. In Dusty Creek, a small plaque was finally added in 2017 at the local Historical Society building. It reads, "To the women who came in war and stayed in silence, we remember you." And perhaps that is all they ever truly wanted, to not be forgotten.